The 56th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will begin its consideration of Agenda Item 62, entitled The Situation in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Tomorrow, 24th of February, marks the second solemn anniversary of the launch by the Russian Federation's, the launch of the Russian Federation's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, plunging its sovereign neighbor and innocent civilians into terror and suffering. The world bore witness as that fateful day marked the onset of a series of protracted, illegal, and flagrant violations of the UN Charter and of international law. As you, the representatives of UN member states, gather here today, you can neither be blind to the ongoing destruction and devastation or ignore the plight of the people of Ukraine. This is especially so because this year also coincides with the 10th anniversary of the 2014 attempted illegal annexation of Crimea and other Ukrainian territories by the Russians. Excellencies, over the past 2 years, millions of innocent civilians have been uprooted from their homes and forced to flee in search of safety and shelter. Schools and hospitals, constituting key elements of civilian infrastructure protected from attack under international law, as symbols of hope and healing, today lie in utter and calculated ruin. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has verified disturbing increases in non-combatant casualties, with the number of civilian deaths and injuries in January of this year hiking 37% higher than in November of 2023. And in the midst of all of this, we must not overlook the peculiar situation of Ukrainian children, thousands of whom were torn from their families and forcibly deported to Russia, thus stripped of the warmth and safety of their homes and loved ones. These innocent children, unlawfully abducted, must be repatriated to Ukraine and reunited with their families at once. But we must also be mindful that the impact of this war extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The environment, the silent victim of conflict, is threatened by the chemical effluent released from damaged facilities and from the increased pollution and greenhouse gas emissions associated with the ongoing fighting. Further, the militarization of the nuclear sites runs the real risk of a nuclear accident, an outcome that would undoubtedly spell a disaster of epic proportions. And ultimately, the war has affected every member state gathered in this hall, whether in the form of soaring food prices or in the context of energy insecurity. Without doubt, this needless war has been a significant catalyst in reshaping world geopolitics and geoeconomics, not only inflicting direct harm on the countries involved, but also impeding the developmental progress of numerous others, especially developing countries. It is actively undermining the very foundations of our UN Charter, threatening the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity we all committed to hold dear and to defend. It has bred and accentuated distrust, instability, and unpredictability on a global scale. It has disrupted the delicate balance of international relations at a time when unity, solidarity, and cooperation are absolutely crucial to multilateral problem solving. Excellencies, we are simultaneously grappling with the existential threat of climate change and strive to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We cannot afford to let aggression and conflict derail our progress. We must never forget, war stands in direct opposition to the goals we have committed to pursue. Consequently, the responsibility falls upon each and every one of us to uphold and to defend the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, our charter, and in doing so, to ensure the primacy of and respect for the rule of law. That includes heeding the orders of international courts, particularly those rendered by the International Court of Justice in March of last year, calling for the Russian Federation to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. While the Security Council may be paralyzed by division, let us draw strength from the collective voice of the General Assembly, which has pronounced itself condemning the aggression and demanding the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Beyond condemnations, we, the United Nations, must actively work towards a comprehensive, just, and sustainable peace in line with the charter of this organization. The resolution adopted by the General Assembly a year ago provides a roadmap to achieve this goal. I note with appreciation the international consultations that have occurred in Denmark, Saudi Arabia, Malta, and most in Davos, Switzerland. These consultations build on the General Assembly's resolutions and represent crucial steps towards finding a permanent solution to this crisis. We must support all efforts that could open the possibility of a process aimed at resolving this conflict through diplomacy and dialogue, always ensuring that such processes align with the foundational principles of the Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Excellencies, honorable ministers, as we reflect on the 2 years of anguish and hardship, let us emerge from this place with a resounding message of solidarity and unwavering support to the resilient people of Ukraine. They have endured unimaginable suffering with dignity, courage, and resilience, and continue to marshal the strong determination to defend their homeland. As the United Nations and this General Assembly, we must stand with them in their quest for justice and peace. And as your president, I join you in this clarion call. Let us redouble our efforts to end wars and usher in a future of hope, promise, and prosperity for the people of Ukraine and Russia alike, and indeed elsewhere without exception. Let us use this meeting to reaffirm our commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and to the rule of law. Together we can build a world where not only does peace prevail, but moreover, justice reigns supreme. I thank you. As announced yesterday via the e-delegate portal, I would like to remind members that they are encouraged to limit their statements to no more than 5 minutes in order to allow as many delegations as possible to deliver statements at the meeting this morning before continuing on Monday, the 26th of February. It is my pleasure now to invite His Excellency Dmytro Kuleba, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, to take the floor. Excellency, the floor is yours.
I am grateful to all UN member states who have consistently supported important General Assembly calls condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine and urging Moscow to cease hostilities. This Assembly has demonstrated on numerous occasions that the global majority stands on the side of Ukraine, which is effectively the side of the UN Charter, international law, and peace. Over 140 member states have chosen exactly such a fair stance. This represents roughly 3/4 of the United Nations. If this Assembly could end the war and restore Ukraine's territorial integrity through passing a bill, Ukraine would already be at peace. If Russia had implemented the order of the International Court of Justice of March 16, 2022, we would also already be living in peace. Let me remind you that the court indicated among its provisional measures that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations it began on February 24, 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. End of quote. This legally binding decision remains in force today. We can also see that in these 2 years, global security has only deteriorated. More and more wars and conflicts are flaring up across the globe. One of the reasons for this is the bleeding wound in the heart of Europe. Unfortunately, Russia ignores the will of the global majority. It continues its aggression and throws more and more men into the flames of war. It persists in killing and maiming Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, as well as brutally violating basic human rights in the occupied territories. Distinguished delegates, Russia cannot ignore the voice of the world majority if we all take a principled stance and act together. The peace formula proposed by President Zelensky represents exactly such an opportunity. You are all aware of the formula's 10 points. They envisage not only the end of hostilities, but also proposals to strengthen food security, nuclear safety, environmental protection, energy security, international justice, human rights, and respect for the UN Charter. Ukraine has been working tirelessly to mobilize international support for our peace plan. In less than a year, the number of countries and international organizations taking part in peace formula meetings went up from 15 to 82. And I thank every nation and every institution, including the United Nations, for joining. This is a growing global understanding that the peace formula is the only way forward to a just and lasting peace. Most importantly, countries involved in this process represent all continents and regions of the world. This is not a Western undertaking. This is a truly global initiative based on the UN Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions. Ukraine is now actively working with partners to prepare the first Global Peace Summit that is set to take place in Switzerland. I strongly encourage every UN member state present in this assembly to take active part in the process and attend the future Global Peace Summit. This will be a real opportunity to agree on a fair and comprehensive vision of peace. Once we have this global and common position, Russia will have no other choice than to engage in this process in good faith. Mr. President, dear member states, the scale of this war and its global implications are enormous, as well as the suffering of Ukrainians. I particularly drive your attention to the fate of thousands of prisoners of war who are still in Russian captivity. They are often mistreated, and Russia obstructs access of international monitors to them. They must be released and exchanged. Human rights violations in the occupied territories include political persecution, arbitrary detentions, torture, and sexual abuse, as well as forced conscription and intentional altering of demographics. Stealing Ukrainian children and taking civilian hostages are some of the most horrible Russian crimes. In our view, UN can and should be more active and swift in deploying existing instruments and developing the new ones when necessary to help bring back Ukrainian children deported to Russia, return civilian captives, the most internationally overlooked vulnerable group, prosecute systemic cases of sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian civilians and servicemen, and crimes against environment. There is literally not a single atrocity listed in the Rome Statute that Russia has not committed in the course of this war. And it is not surprising that the Russian president himself is on the ICC wanted list for stealing Ukrainian kids. And with all of this in the background, Russia has enough insolence to try to shift the blame and evade responsibility. It spread numerous lies in order to manipulate public opinion abroad and blame others for the war that Moscow says started and refuses to end. I therefore call on everyone present in this assembly and outside of it to dismiss Russian lies. They are nothing more than attempts to shift the blame and avoid responsibility. The only reason for this war has been and remains Russia's denial of Ukraine's right to exist and its continued colonial conquest. Moscow's aim is to destroy Ukraine, and they're quite outspoken about it. Dear colleagues, fellow diplomats, no nation in the world wants peace more than Ukraine. Our country suffers the most, but we also know that peace must be just and durable. Simply putting the war on hold and hoping that the aggressor will be merciful enough to eventually choose peace is not a realistic plan. Those who say that Ukraine just needs to negotiate with Russia and end the war are either ill-informed or never followed what happened between 2014 and 2022. During that 8 years, Ukraine and Russia held approximately 200 rounds of peace negotiations in various formats and made 20 ceasefire agreements. All of these peace efforts ended 2 years ago, when Russia tore apart the Minsk process and launched its full-scale invasion of my country. Why would anyone suggest today that following the same logic will bring us to a different result? Ukraine's peace formula remains the only serious peace proposal on the table. and every peace-loving nation in this assembly, and I'm certain that the absolute majority of you represent peace-loving nations, can add its diplomatic weight to putting the peace formula in action. If we are serious about restoring peace not only in Ukraine but also globally, it is time to abandon wishful thinking and engage in realistic and hard work. The Global Peace Summit offers exactly such a concrete and realistic path to peace. I urge all of you to assist us in the undertaking. And I would also like to conclude by saying thank you to every nation that has stood by the people of Ukraine throughout these terrible years. We shall jointly prevail. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to take the floor.
Господин председатель, думаю, что для каждого, кто способен на самостоятельный, незашоренный анализ ситуации, очевидно, что вынесенная сегодня на обсуждение Генеральной Ассамблеи ООН тема не имеет ничего общего с действительностью и носит исключительно заказной политический характер. Реальность же такова, что временно оккупированных территорий Украины не существует. Но есть российские регионы: Крым, 10-ю годовщину воссоединения, с которым мы будем отмечать уже в марте, и присоединившиеся по итогам законного волеизъявления народа Донецкой и Луганской республики, а также Херсонской и Запорожской области. Сегодня мы услышали и еще услышим много вранья на эту тему от представителей Киева и его западных спонсоров. За этим прослеживается стремление не просто исказить факты, но и вообще переписать историю. Дело в том, что ее правдивая, неискаженная версия для наших западных коллег крайне неудобна. Ведь тогда им придется признать свою ответственность за провоцирование и развязывание украинского кризиса, за многолетнюю подготовку Украины к войне с Россией под ширмой Минских договоренностей, за взращивание на Украине ростков национализма и неонацизма, которые после 2013 года расцвели там буйным цветом. Ничего этого наши западные коллеги делать, разумеется, не хотят. Их интересам отвечает насаждение черно-белого нарратива, где Россия агрессор, а Украина невинная жертва. Однако отвечать за сделанное с Украиной коллективному Западу все-таки придется, как и за избирательную слепоту и глухоту, проявлявшуюся им все последние годы. Как могут страны, претендующие на то, чтобы называться цивилизованными и демократическими, не услышать, например, сделанную в 2015 году заявлений премьер-министра Яценюка о том, что на Донбассе проживают нелюди, или произнесенных в 2021 году слов действующего президента Зеленского, который назвал их существами и особями. У тех, кто владеет фактами о действиях киевского режима и не пытается подменить действительность пропагандистскими речевками, не возникает вопросов о причинах вхождения в состав Российской Федерации новых субъектов. Оно стало закономерным следствием политики истребления собственного населения неонацистским режимом, пришедшим к власти в 2014 году в результате кровавого переворота, организованного, спонсированного и открыто поддержанного Западом. Всегда чувствовавшие свою неразрывную историческую и культурную связь с Россией, проживающие на юго-востоке граждане Украины, не захотели подчиниться новой нелегитимной власти, требовавшей от них отказаться от собственной культурной и исторической идентичности и прославлять пособников Гитлера, ответственных за массовые убийства евреев, поляков, русских, украинцев в годы Второй мировой войны. Тогда постмайданные радикалы и националисты встали на путь игнорирования основополагающих прав и свобод своих же соотечественников, устроив гонения на неугодное население по национальному, языковому и религиозному признакам. Ввели финансовую и социальную блокаду жителям Донбасса. Прекратили выплачивать социальные пособия и пенсии. Лишали услуг здравоохранения. Чуть ли не каждый год принимали законы, все более усугубляющие положение населения Донбасса. На протяжении 8 лет их методично и безнаказанно обстреливали, калечили и убивали. Можно долго перечислять бесчеловечные преступления украинских карательных батальонов в отношении ни в чем не повинных людей. Напомню лишь про трагедию в Одесском доме профсоюзов, где, когда погибло 48 человек, 42 были заживо сожжены, а тех, кому удалось выпрыгнуть из окон полыхающего здания, добивали и расстреливали. Или про смерть горловской Мадонны при артобстреле в 2014 году. Кадры искалеченного тела молодой женщины, прижимающей к груди 10-месячную дочь, облетели весь мир и стали символом бесчеловечной политики новых властей в Киеве. Остались незамеченными западными покровителями бандеровских неонацистов. И таких примеров можно привести сотни. Крыму повезло больше. Почти сразу после госпереворота, верно оценив истинное лицо новой власти, крымчане сделали выбор в пользу возвращения на свою историческую родину и в соответствии с правом на самоопределение, зафиксированным в Уставе ООН. Дальнейшие события подтвердили правильность такого шага. Уже после начала специальной военной операции, призванной остановить 8-летнюю войну киевского режима против мирного населения Донбасса, путь крымчан повторили еще 4 бывших украинских региона. Подобный поворот событий крайне неудобен для Украины, ведь рассказы про то, что жители Украины боятся российских вооруженных сил, что они столкнутся с настоящей партизанской войной, вдребезги разбиваются о неопровержимые факты, свидетельствующие об обратном. Население освобожденных городов встречает бойцов как освободителей, благодарит за то, что Россия их не бросила. Только что мы наблюдали, как радуются нашим солдатам мирные жители в освобожденной Авдеевке, где укронацисты за 9 лет создали сверхукрепленный рубеж, с которого методично обстреливали расположенный в нескольких километрах Донецк. А раньше, до начала специальной военной операции, настоящим бельмом на глазу для киевского режима были публикации своих сограждан, миллион которых ежегодно отдыхал в российском Крыму и публиковал восторженные отклики в соцсетях. Представитель Киева в своем выступлении, разумеется, не сказал, что Крымский полуостров в составе Украины был абсолютно заброшенным регионом. Его инфраструктурой не занимались. Социально-экономические проблемы решались по остаточному принципу и не носили общесистемного характера. За последние же 10 лет Крым преобразился. Реализуются социально-экономические проекты в сферах здравоохранения, культуры и образования. Реальные зарплаты в бюджетном секторе, а также пенсии и пособия растут. Введены в строй тепловые электростанции. Активно продвигается строительство газовых магистралей и транспортной инфраструктуры. Стоящий достаточно остро вопрос безопасности водоснабжения из-за действий неонацистов, устроивших Крыму водную блокаду, тоже решен. 2 года назад была, наконец, ликвидирована дамба, возведенная Украиной для перекрытия водотока. Проделана гигантская работа по повышению инвестиционной и туристической привлекательности региона. Отдельно хочу остановиться на соблюдении прав и свобод всех нацменьшинств, проживающих на территории Крыма. На протяжении последних лет Киев стращал всех якобы ущемлением России прав крымских татар, стиранием их идентичности. Однако недавнее решение Международного суда ООН по соответствующему иску Украины по Международной конвенции о ликвидации всех форм расовой дискриминации полностью показало несостоятельность этих претензий. Более того, суд не нашел признаков расовой дискриминации в российском законодательстве и практике его применения. Отверг он и ложные обвинения в дискриминации крымских татар и украинцев в отношении доступа к СМИ, образованию и возможности реализации своих культурных потребностей на крымско-татарском и украинском языках. Крайне показательный следующий факт, вскрывшийся в ходе судебного разбирательства. Киев пытался обвинить Россию в уничтожении культурного наследия Крыма. По факту же было установлено, что наше государство занималось масштабной и дорогостоящей реставрацией исторических памятников, которые пришли в запустение и начали разрушаться в период нахождения полуострова в составе Украины. В Новороссии и на Донбассе также осуществляются проекты по возрождению этих регионов, продвигается их интеграция в единое правовое и социально-экономическое пространство страны. Восстанавливается промышленность, сельское хозяйство и инфраструктура. Поставлена цель к 2030 году вывести регионы на общероссийский уровень по ключевым направлениям, определяющим качество жизни человека. Самое же главное, во всех этих процессах с энтузиазмом участвуют сами наши новые граждане, которые именно с Россией связывают свое будущее. Господин председатель, если в ретроспективе посмотреть на все случившееся за последние 10 лет, то сам собой возникает вопрос, можно ли было всего этого избежать. Не Россия начала эту войну, Россия пришла, чтобы наконец ее остановить. Киевской власти всего-то нужно было уважать права людей, дать им возможность спокойно существовать на своей территории, обучаться на родном языке, иметь свободу вероисповедания и отличную от насаждаемой точку зрения. Не уклоняться от прямого диалога с несогласными, а приложить необходимые усилия для обеспечения достойного будущего в составе Украины. Кстати сказать, это ровно то, что обещал перед президентскими выборами в 2019 году кандидат Зеленский, за которого в итоге проголосовало 2/3 избирателей. Однако, придя к власти, он все эти обещания забыл и втянулся в западную геополитическую игру против России. И шанс на мир был упущен. Что же делать сейчас, спрашивают нас многие. Что может вернуть мир на Украину? Мы уже много раз говорили, что для этого должны быть выполнены цели нашей специальной военной операции, сформулированные по итогам 8 лет постмайданного развития Украины. Мы готовы сделать это путем переговоров и никогда от них не отказывались, в отличие от киевского режима, который под наускивание западных кукловодов во главе с Борисом Джонсоном отказался от диалога с нами и подписания уже парафированного в Стамбуле в апреле 2022 года соглашения и принял закон, запрещающий вести с Россией какие-либо переговоры, обрекший на гибель десятки тысяч несчастных молодых и не очень молодых украинцев, бросая их в топкую мясорубку, принося кровавую жертву богу войны. Но не стоит тратить время на пустые планы киевского режима вести переговоры на основе так называемой формулы мира Зеленского, которая является ничем иным, как ультиматумом России и попыткой всеми правдами и неправдами заманить в бесконечные заседания на основе этого утопического проекта как можно больше стран. Эта фальшивка уже понятна многим из тех, кто поначалу невольно оказался втянутым в эту лживую затею Киева. Если не будет настоящих переговоров, основанных на реальной оценке ситуации на земле, цели специальной военной операции все равно будут достигнуты. Господин председатель, 80 лет назад, 22 февраля 1944 года, был издан приказ о награждении командира минометного взвода, младшего лейтенанта Семена Ивановича орденом Красной Звезды за доблесть и мужество, проявленные в ходе освобождения Украины от немецких нацистов. Ему еще не было 20 лет. Если бы сегодня он был жив и захотел бы почтить память своих однополчан, его бы арестовали, возможно, избили и бросили бы в застенки СБУ, где замучили бы до смерти, как это сделали с американским журналистом Гонсало Лирой. Такой режим на Украине установил его внук Владимир, который сегодня чествует в качестве героев нацистских преступников и коллаборантов, уничтоживших в годы войны сотни тысяч евреев, поляков, русских и украинцев. И этот режим сегодня пытается спасти тех, кто 80 лет назад вместе с нами боролся с нацизмом. Не случайно не только проигравшие во Второй мировой войне Германия, Италия и Япония, но и весь западный лагерь выступает сегодня против осуждения нацизма в Генассамблее. А те, кто воевал в рядах СС, чествуют в парламенте Канады. Кстати, сегодня в России отмечается праздник День защитника Отечества. В этот день мы отдаем дань памяти всем ветеранам, нашим отцам, дедам и прадедам, отдавшим свою жизнь, защищая Родину. Благодаря их воинским подвигам и отваге наш народ сокрушил нацизм 80 лет назад и сокрушит его и сейчас. С праздником, дорогие защитники! Наше дело правое, и мы победим.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and I now invite His Excellency Xavier Bettel, the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg, to take the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je dois vous dire que de parler après le représentant de la Fédération de Russie n'est pas tâche facile. Je suis venu ici et comme toujours, une fois qu'on leur parle, ils s'en vont. Donc, ils prônent le dialogue, mais le dialogue de la chaise vide n'est pas facile, Monsieur l'ambassadeur. Première chose, vous demandez le dialogue. Je fais partie des rares chefs de gouvernement qui avaient un contact avec le président Poutine et avec le président Zelensky au début du conflit. Je l'ai fait. Pour avoir un dialogue, il faut aussi avoir une écoute. Et je dois vous dire que, même si ça surprend les uns et les autres, que j'avais cette écoute de la part du président Poutine, je l'avais aussi, bien sûr, de la part de Volodymyr Zelensky. Mais il faut aussi qu'après une écoute et des engagements, il y ait des résultats. Et j'ai vu que du côté russe, la volonté de cesser la guerre était la dernière de leurs priorités. Et Boutcha, Irpin, juste après des discussions où on me dit qu'on veut la paix, était la preuve que ce n'était pas leur volonté. Donc aujourd'hui, on se retrouve ici pour pas célébrer, car une célébration est quelque chose de heureux, mais tout simplement pour montrer qu'on est du côté de l'Ukraine. Et pourquoi je suis si sensible à cette question, monsieur le représentant de la Fédération de Russie, c'est moi-même ayant une grand-mère russe et un grand-père polonais juif. Et quand vous dites ici à cette tribune qu'il y a des nazis à Kiev, et moi, il n'y en a pas plus à Kiev qu'à Moscou ou à Saint-Pétersbourg. Il est honteux de faire croire que le régime de l'Ukraine et de Kiev soutient des nazis et que l'Ukraine serait remplie de nazis. Et de vouloir, en fait, aujourd'hui réécrire l'histoire en disant que vous protégez la Russie contre des nazis, parce que vous l'avez fait pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, c'est ne pas rendre service et même faire une honte à ces combattants russes qui sont morts pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Comparer ce qui est comparable n'est pas une attaque unilatérale. Ici, vous êtes un grand pays. Et je vous l'ai dit, la question est très sensible pour moi et quelque chose qui me tient à cœur. Alors on essaie de nous diviser en Europe, on essaie de nous diviser au niveau mondial. Alors il y a les pro-russes, il y a les pro-russes. Et je tiens à le dire, je l'ai dit aussi au président Poutine quand je l'avais en ligne, de savoir que ses meilleurs amis se trouvent à Pyongyang ou en Syrie ou en Iran, ça montre quand même l'isolation de la Russie par rapport à ce que l'on a connu avant. Cette Russie qui, après une période de communisme, est sortie et cherchait des partenaires, avait des relations culturelles, des relations politiques, des relations économiques, des relations amicales avec les pays, se trouve aujourd'hui isolée. Et je l'ai dit lors de la dernière réunion que nous avions chez notre collègue à Skopje, et que je salue ici aussi, je l'ai dit à représentants russes aussi. Commencer une guerre n'est pas une grandeur en politique, c'est terminer une guerre et de savoir quand il est temps de reconnaître une erreur qui montre la grandeur d'un politique. Aujourd'hui, nous avions des violations même des fondements de cette Assemblée. Nous retrouvons ici, nous venons d'écouter un discours qui montre que tous propos que l'on peut avoir sont déplacés par rapport aux propos qui ont été faits de la partie russe, qui ne correspondent pas à la réalité. Et on ne peut pas réécrire l'histoire au lieu de reconnaître tout simplement une erreur. De dire que vous défendiez la population russe, que vous voulez défendre aujourd'hui presque l'Europe contre des nazis en Ukraine, alors que le résultat est qu'aujourd'hui les voisins de l'Ukraine tremblent. Les voisins, que ce soit les pays baltes, que ce soit les pays, la Pologne, la Roumanie, que ce soit la Moldavie, la Géorgie, sont des pays qui ont peur de l'agresseur russe et qui ne dorment plus tranquillement du fait que la Russie est devenue un pays imprévisible, un pays dangereux, un pays qui ne respecte aucun droit qu'on aimerait pourtant voir respecter et qui sont pour nous une des choses les plus importantes. Et vous l'avez dit, monsieur l'ambassadeur de Russie aussi, qu'il était important de retrouver ces territoires russes. Mais on ne fait pas les frontières pendant la nuit, dans un cauchemar ou dans un rêve, à redéfinir des nouvelles frontières. Le droit international fait que les frontières sont préétablies. Et on ne décide pas parce qu'on est plus grand, parce qu'on est plus fort, que l'on va redéfinir la taille de son pays et prendre quelque chose à quelqu'un. Je l'ai connu, moi, au Grand-Duché de Luxembourg, monsieur le Président. Je viens d'un pays qui avait un voisin plus grand, plus fort, qui était l'Allemagne. Aujourd'hui, l'Allemagne est mon partenaire, l'Allemagne est mon ami, l'Allemagne est mon voisin. L'Allemagne est celui avec qui je veux construire quelque chose. Réalisez ce que vous êtes en train de faire. J'ai eu M. Poutine plusieurs fois en ligne, je fais partie, et je vais peut-être choquer l'un ou l'autre. Le jour où vous comprenez que vous êtes prêt à retourner autour de la table, il peut contacter. Je fais partie de ces gens qui sont prêts à lui parler, mais qu'ils reconnaissent les erreurs qu'il a faites. Mais qu'on arrête de tuer des générations, de priver des enfants d'éducation, car aujourd'hui, les enfants ne peuvent plus avoir une éducation normale. Et comment expliquerez-vous à ces femmes, à ces enfants, à ces mères russes, que vous avez envoyé leurs enfants à l'abattoir, tout simplement pour une erreur que vous avez commise? Comment l'expliquerez-vous dans les livres d'histoire? Est-ce que ce sera de nouveau quelque chose qui sera supprimé des news, de l'actualité en Russie, parce que ça gêne les uns ou les autres? L'impunité aussi est quelque chose que l'on doit toujours se rappeler. On ne peut pas agresser quelqu'un en se disant qu'il ne se passera rien après. Vous savez qu'aujourd'hui, vos soutiens sont de plus en plus faibles, de plus en plus réduits. Moi, je peux juste vous dire que l'Ukraine est un pays qui est agressé, qu'il y a un agresseur, c'est la Russie, que nous continuerons à soutenir l'Ukraine, que nous continuerons à soutenir les collègues qui, aujourd'hui, sont victimes de votre agression, mais réalisez un jour que vous avez peut-être pensé que les Ukrainiens, et quand j'étais là-bas sur place, quand vous allez en Ukraine, reconnaissons aussi la force des Ukrainiens. Beaucoup d'entre nous ont cru que l'Ukraine, ça allait durer 3 ou 4 jours et puis ce serait terminé, que la Russie allait les terrasser. Les Ukrainiens se battent, mais ils ne se battent pas que pour eux, ils se battent aussi pour nous. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
I thank the distinguished representative of Luxembourg, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Slovenia, Her Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. These days we are marking the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and almost 10 years since the destabilization of the region has begun with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. The second and 10th anniversary are an opportunity to recap what the UN and its member states can do in order to stabilize the region and bring just and lasting peace to Ukraine. There have been many discussions about what can be done and what should be done in this respect. Allow me to present Slovenia's take in few points. 1, peace. Peace should come to Ukraine. It may seem impossible at times, but it will happen. What we can do to expedite it is to support the peace process that is taking shape within Ukraine's peace formula. Russia needs to do its part. Russia must stop the aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Its war rhetoric and threats need to cease. Another important step towards peace where we can aid Ukraine is to support global and regional initiatives aimed at providing a stable foothold for its reconstruction and environmental recovery. Slovenia is gravely concerned with existing environmental impacts of the war and is dreading potential ones. All of us can continue to support the EIEA and its efforts to prevent a nuclear accident in Ukraine. 2, international humanitarian law should and must be respected. With all the ruined homes, hospitals, and schools, and with civilian casualties on the rise for the consecutive months, this is obviously not the case. If lasting peace is to come to Ukraine, accountability needs to be assured. What we can do in this respect is to lay the groundwork for justice to be served in the future. We can support the strengthening of the international legal framework and assist in the establishment of the Special Tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The recently signed Ljubljana, the Hague Convention, is an important complementary mechanism responding to violations by fighting impunity and promoting accountability for the most serious international crimes. And 3, the humanitarian situation should be addressed. We are witnessing the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. An estimated 14.6 million Ukrainians will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. And we should take care that it reaches as many as possible, especially in light of increasing needs in other crisis areas around the world, such as Gaza. Slovenia will do its part. At the same time, 30% of Ukraine is contaminated with landmines, the highest percentage of any country in the world. We see humanitarian demining as a vital step towards normalization and economic recovery of the country. Mr. President, let me conclude with the following. There is no room for double standards. No one should ignore violations of international law, neither in Ukraine nor in Gaza. We will not allow undermining of international organizations. We will not allow undermining of our institutions. We demand respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law across the board by everyone, everywhere, and at all the time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia, and I now invite Her Excellency Helena Carreras, the Minister of National Defense of Poland, no? Portugal, to take the floor.
President, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on the situation of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. It has now been 10 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. More than 700 days of death and destruction have passed. More than 700 days of a war that has taken its toll on innocent civilians, with a disproportionate burden inflicted on women, children, and the elderly. More than 700 days of human suffering, death, injury, displacement, loss of critical infrastructure, reduced access to healthcare and education, and curtailment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. On this somber date, we cannot and will not fail to reiterate our resolute and unwavering condemnation of Russia's unprovoked, illegal, and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a blatant violation of international law for which it must be held fully accountable. From the outset, Portugal has been unequivocal about where we stand, side by side with Ukraine in the defense of rules, principles, and values that should guide us all. Rules, principles, and values that are enshrined in the UN Charter. We are part of the overwhelming majority of this General Assembly, which has voted in favor of 6 resolutions condemning the invasion and calling for the end of Russia's war of aggression. Our support is comprehensive, be it on the political, financial, humanitarian, and also at the military level. We will continue to assist the brave Ukrainian armed forces in exercising its legitimate right to self-defense against an illegal aggression. We have welcomed nearly 6,000 refugees in Portugal while focusing on reconstruction efforts, such as in the case of the public school system of the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr. But this discussion is not just about Ukraine. It is about upholding the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. We cannot remain on the sidelines while the most fundamental principles of the international legal and security order are blatantly disregarded. None of us can feel safe until this war ends. This can only happen with a comprehensive and just solution that is in accordance with the UN Charter and in line with Ukraine's peace formula. But let us recall that any such solution cannot fail to consider the occupied territories of Crimea and Donbas since 2014. Allow me to be very clear. We do not recognize these illegal annexation attempts. Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson are part of Ukraine. The report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, dated last October, gives us an appalling picture of the situation in terms of human rights and highlights the many cases of torture and violence, including sexual violence, perpetrated against civilians with a disproportionate impact on women, children, and older persons. That is why we support every action being taken by the International Criminal Court to hold accountable those responsible for these atrocities and to ensure justice for all the victims. Portugal also participates in the core group for accountability of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and support the Council of Europe's Register of Damage. The humanitarian crisis caused by this war has to end. President, when I visited Kyiv on February 2023, on the first anniversary of the Russian invasion, it was impossible to remain indifferent to the bravery of a people besieged by an unscrupulous aggressor. This bravery only found correspondence in the unshakable confidence of a nation determined to defeat a brutal and unjustified invasion. The remarkable resilience of Ukrainian men and women and their will to prevail are an inspiration to the world and a lesson to the aggressor. Yet, the impacts of this war are not confined to Europe. Russia's aggression has a direct effect on the global food, energy, and financial crisis, with severe impacts on the most vulnerable countries. The role of the UN Secretary General in mitigating these effects has proven invaluable. But this situation cannot be tolerated, and we will continue to support all collective efforts in this regard. We know that other pressing crises around the world require our attention and our action, but we need to be coherent, and therefore we cannot fail the people of Ukraine. So, together, united, we must remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished Minister of National Defense of Portugal. And I now invite His Excellency Buhar Usmani, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, to take the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on this important occasion as we mark 2 years of Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor. 2 years, a war of aggression in Europe in the 21st century. 2 years of Russia's continued attempt to influence, interfere, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe. And 2 full years of death, destruction, and human suffering. Excellencies, I urge Russia once again to end this senseless war and withdraw its troops from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russia violated the basic principles of international law and UN Charter and launched a fully fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, a UN member state, and a peaceful neighbor. We condemn and reject the attempted illegal annexation by Russia of Ukraine's territories, as we have witnessed since 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and Sevastopol. Furthermore, Russia has committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which have been documented by international monitoring mechanisms alleging war crimes. North Macedonia is also strongly concerned and condemns Russia's unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and Belarus and calls upon them to ensure their safe return. Mr. President, the war of aggression against Ukraine stands in stark contrast to our shared commitment to peace, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, shaking security fundamentals of Europe. This war has changed our way of life and challenged the very essence of the word freedom. Along with our strong condemnations of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we concurrently condemn Russia's continuous attempts to interfere, influence, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe. While we are witnessing a full-scale war against Ukraine, in parallel, we are observing ongoing hybrid threats across Europe's regions and in Balkans also. The hybridity of Russia's hostile campaigns beyond Ukraine diverge from region to region, but the pattern and the anticipated end results are identical, generating instability and chaos. Russia, through its known hybrid means, is present in every societal pore. In North Macedonia and across our region, in the heart of Europe, we feel the adversity and the negative effects of this strategic influence. The security risks for Europe are imminent. It's clear, lingering threat to the whole of Europe, and we must say no to Russia's hostile campaign. Our response to this is defining our own future trajectory. Our response is clear: no to Russia, yes to Europe, strong, united, and integrated. Our shared no to Russia has to be loud, resolute, and consistent. It is our duty to expose Russia across the multilateral space and to keep insisting on moral, legal, and political accountability, to disarm and dismantle the system of disinformation and false narratives, to separate good from bad, truth from lies, right from wrong. Our country belongs and stands aside with the rest of the free world that believes in the ideals of peace, liberty, and democracy, fully aware and cognizant of the ultimate value and importance of these differences. North Macedonia is a functional multi-ethnic democracy resting on solid foundations. Our past and present speaks of a resilient society capable to withstand different trials and challenges. Mr. President, we must say no to Russia for the sake of the new generations, so they can live in peace, freed from fear of war and distrustful sense of insecurity, that the destiny of the Ukrainians could one day be their own. We reiterate the importance of investigating the war crimes on the territory of Ukraine, and North Macedonia will continue to engage in the work of the core group on options for the establishment of a tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Excellencies, the discussion in this plenary is not only about Ukraine, but about each and every country present in the General Assembly. It is about respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states who rely on the norms and principles of international law and observe the Charter of the United Nations. It is about our shared democratic values and interests. It is about the sovereign rights of each state to choose its future. It is about the sovereign right of each state to defend itself against aggression. And the Russian Federation, a P5 member, violated these fundamental principles cherished by all and agreed upon by all. I call you to stand united and support Ukraine. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, and I now invite His Excellency Gordan Grilish Radman, the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, to take the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. After 2 long and painful years, Russia is still conducting its brutal military aggression against Ukraine. Such flagrant breach of international law and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter is an affront to the fundamental values of peace, security, and respect for the sovereignty of all nations. This aggression brings us to the brink of breaking the global system as a whole, endangering the ideas of freedom, sovereignty, and independence. We call on Russia to cease all combat operations and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. We regret the tremendous loss of all life resulting from Russia's senseless war and reaffirm our steadfast support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the much desired peace can only be lasting if it is just. For peace to be just, it has to be anchored in accountability. For this reason, accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine must be upheld, not only because it provides justice to the victims, but also because it helps prevent future atrocities. With this in mind, Croatia supports efforts to promote accountability for international crimes committed in and against Ukraine in all relevant multilateral fora, including the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. We have stood by Ukraine and its people from day one. We have provided aid, and over 25,000 Ukrainians have found temporary protection in Croatia. Croatia herself was a victim of aggression and has had war on her soil. Following our own painful experience, today we not only understand but strongly support and participate in all initiatives aimed at relieving the suffering of Ukrainian population, especially the weakest and the most vulnerable ones. Besides the energy crisis, one of the most dramatic effects of the Russian aggression is the threat of food shortage looming over large parts of the world. Ukraine needs our collective support in its demining efforts. Croatia herself, with vast experience in demining her own territory, will remain committed to national and international actions in addressing the security and humanitarian concerns posed by these weapons and their indiscriminate use. Landmines in Ukraine are not just a Ukrainian or a European problem. Just like the current war, they have a global impact. Much of the world's most fertile land will remain contaminated by them for decades to come. In that regard, the global food supply, and with it, our activity will remain hindered and disrupted. In this vein, Croatia hosted the first ever high-level international donors conference on humanitarian demining in Ukraine in October 2023 in Zagreb. This conference, co-organized by the governments of Croatia and Ukraine, confirmed the support to Ukraine's demining efforts by 34 participating countries, pledging €500 million overall. Croatia will continue to support Ukraine. The aggression against Ukraine concerns us all in all corners of the world. Our collective efforts to achieve just and lasting peace in Ukraine must be redoubled. I assure you, Mr. President, of Croatia's unwavering commitment to this common task. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, and I now invite His Excellency Ignacio Cassi, the head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, to the podium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs. Le 24 février 2022, il y a 2 ans, nous nous sommes éveillés en Suisse et en toute l'Europe dans un cauchemar. Ce lointain spectre de la guerre s'était soudainement matérialisé devant nous. Toutes les précautions prises pendant 75 ans pour prévenir la répétition des tragédies du XXe siècle semblaient soudainement vaines. Ni le multilatéralisme, ni le droit international public ne semblaient capables de résister à la force militaire. Après le choc initial, après l'incrédulité face à des images aussi horribles, nous avons commencé à nous interroger. Comment cela a-t-il été rendu possible? Entre-temps, des milliers de vies ont été perdues. Des millions de personnes ont été déplacées et d'innombrables familles ont été déchirées par ces événements tragiques. Aujourd'hui, je tiens à réitérer notre pleine solidarité avec le peuple ukrainien qui traverse cette catastrophe. Il est certainement contre-productif de simplement s'apitoyer sur leur sort ou de se sentir impuissant. je suis fermement convaincu que nous devons trouver la détermination nécessaire pour agir, pour revitaliser les outils à notre disposition, dans le but de mettre un terme aux violations flagrantes du droit international et des droits de l'homme. Ici, mesdames et messieurs, ici au siège de l'ONU, nous avons le devoir de respecter le mandat confié par cette Assemblée. Assurer au peuple des nations le droit de vivre en paix. Cela implique de restaurer la paix et la justice en Ukraine. Mesdames et messieurs, le chemin qui amène à la paix tient dans une main. Il s'agit de notre charte. Il tient dans une main. Égalité souveraine entre les États, respect de l'intégrité territoriale, interdiction du recours à la force. Voilà, pas plus difficile que ça. Tout est là, dans ce texte fondamental, garant de nos valeurs universelles et de l'ordre multilatéral. Cette Assemblée a toujours tenu le cap. C'était le cas lors de la résolution en faveur d'une paix juste, globale et durable en Ukraine, adoptée ici dans cette salle le 23 février de l'année passée par une large majorité d'entre nous. Et pourtant, nous devons le constater, l'horizon ukrainien reste bouché malgré notre unité affichée dans cette salle. Sur la voie de la paix, nous n'avons pas encore trouvé d'unité. La Suisse est déterminée à y contribuer, déterminée à contribuer non seulement à la paix, mais également à protéger les civils vulnérables aux effets dévastateurs de la guerre. Nous persévérons sans relâche dans notre engagement en faveur du respect des conventions de Genève. Depuis 1864, véritable pilier du droit international humanitaire dont, vous le savez, la Suisse est garante. À Genève, il y a exactement 160 ans, naissait la première convention sur le droit international humanitaire. Et il y a exactement 75 ans, la 4e convention. Cet anniversaire devrait nous inciter à réfléchir. Après 160 ans, nous n'avons toujours pas véritablement appris. La recherche d'une voie réaliste vers la paix en Ukraine demeure un objectif primordial pour mon pays. À la demande de l'Ukraine, nous avons l'intention d'organiser d'ici cet été une conférence de haut niveau pour la paix en Ukraine. Je saisis donc cette opportunité qui m'est offerte aujourd'hui pour inviter toutes les nations, vous tous, du nord au sud, de l'est à l'ouest, vous inviter à coopérer à notre objectif commun, trouver un terrain d'entente pour la paix en Ukraine et reprendre le chemin tracé par notre charte. Mesdames et messieurs, restons des nations unies et ne nous laissons pas entraîner dans la spirale de la force militaire ni dans la tentation du pouvoir qui nous transforme en puissance désunie. Je vous remercie.
I thank the head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, and I now invite His Excellency Radoslaw Sikorski, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, to the podium.
Excellencies, on the 21st of February 2022, 3 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Kenya's permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador Martin Kimani, spoke in the Security Council. In his short but remarkable speech, the ambassador talked about African countries' borders, inherited from the colonial empires, drawn with no regard for the existing nations and cultures. It certainly did not make life any easier for the inhabitants of those states. They could look backward and pursue racial, ethnic, or religious homogeneity and plunge into long-lasting conflicts. But they took a different path. Let me quote Ambassador Kimani. "We agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental, political, economic, and legal integration. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace." End of quote. I remain grateful for these inspiring remarks. The courageous vision of the Kenyan ambassador contrasts starkly with the path chosen by the Russian Federation. Despite being a permanent Security Council member, Russia has repeatedly violated the UN Charter. It's trying to crush a sovereign state and exterminate its cultural identity. It shocked the world with brutality unseen for decades. We will never forget the atrocities committed in Bucha, Mariupol, or Kramatorsk. It decided to block the transport of grain and to use food as a weapon, even though the number of people suffering from hunger is growing at an alarming rate. Today, on the eve of the second anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin shows no intention to change the course, quite the reverse. The aggression resonates globally, causing economic turbulence that affects us all. 2 years ago, the General Assembly adopted the resolution condemning Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity. It demanded that Russia immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from Ukraine within the internationally recognized borders. 141 United Nations members stood up for Ukraine and against the breach of the international order. As we expressed our position clearly and reiterated it on several other occasions in the General Assembly, we committed ourselves to support the victim. We must fulfill this commitment. We must restore the world based on the principles of sovereignty of nations, inviolability of the borders, and respect for personal freedoms. We must hold the perpetrators and their accomplices accountable for their crimes. Only our resolve can deter the neo-imperial delusions that may arise in any part of the world. We need to stay the course until Mr. Putin understands that the days of European imperialism are gone for good. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, and I now invite His Excellency David Cameron, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, I want to cover 3 points. First, the history. 2 years ago, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But let's go back a little further. In 2008, I visited Tbilisi in Georgia, shortly after Russian forces invaded South Ossetia. I said then that if we did not stand up to Putin, he would be back for more. In 2014, I was Prime Minister as his little green men seized control of Crimea. I said again that if we did not stand up to Putin, he would be back for more. Now, having tried and failed to conquer all of Ukraine, the lesson of this history is clear. If we do not stand up to Putin, he will be back for more. Compared to 2008 and 2014, I do believe the world has started properly to wake up to Putin's menace. Yet here is the tragedy of it all. Prior to 2014, did Ukraine pose a threat to Russia? No. Did Russia object to the formation of the Ukrainian state in 1991? No. Did it in 1994 when signing the Budapest Memorandum? No. In fact, Russia pledged never to use force against Ukraine. If the Ukrainian state was such a threat to Russian-speaking residents, why did every region of Ukraine vote for independence, Crimea and the Donbass included? Cut through ludicrous accusations of Nazism against a state with a Jewish president, and what are you left with? Nothing but the ahistorical claim that Ukraine's very existence is anti-Russian, a claim which runs contrary to the principle of self-determination, one of the foundations of the United Nations. Putin tries to claim that Russia is fighting not against Ukraine, but against the whole of the West. He claims we are somehow out to dismember Russia. That is the central lie of this war. The truth is that we, myself included, spent years trying to build a new relationship with Moscow after the end of the Cold War. We did that because we profoundly believe that a secure, stable Russia, at peace with its neighbors, is in our interests and the world's. It is a tragedy that Putin prefers to hark back to the 9th century to justify aggression rather than taking up this offer of a different path. And turning to the consequences of all this, the scenes in territories liberated from Russia defy belief. Take Bucha, as has just been said. Mutilated bodies of civilians with hands bound, shot at close range. A children's center turned into a torture chamber. The rape of teenage girls. Disturbing radio intercepts of Russian soldiers referring to this as cleansing. Or consider places still held by Russia. Business gone. Independent media quashed. The rights of minorities, such as the Crimean Tatars, denied. Sinister re-education centers. Forcible deportations, with children torn from their parents to be raised as Russians. Ukrainians forced to accept Russian passports or drafted to fight for Putin. Citizens forced to vote in sham referendums, and now, outrageously, Russian presidential elections held on Ukrainian territory. Crimea, in particular, now far more dependent on Moscow for budget support than it ever was to Kyiv. Invasion has brought these regions neither peace nor prosperity, and nor has Putin's gambit benefited Russians. No Russian soldier had died fighting Ukraine before 2014. Now they have suffered over 300,000 casualties. Moreover, since the invasion, Russia has suffered its first attempted coup in over 3 decades and its first debt default for over a century. Nor has the rest of the world been spared the consequences of this war. Rising energy and food costs have fueled inflation. This has had consequences, especially for the world's poorest. And this leads to my final point, why we must stay strong. 2 years on, I recognize some want to rethink. There is a sense of fatigue. There are other problems. A compromise might seem attractive, but this is wrong. We must recognize the cost of giving up. Putin has said there will be no peace until Russia's goals are achieved. And in his recent interview, he studiously avoided confirming he was satisfied with the land seized from Ukraine at present. This is not a man seeking compromise. Rather, this is a neo-imperialist bully who believes that might is right. And an unjust peace now merely invites a return to fighting in Ukraine when it suits him. But ultimately, we must stay strong, not only for the sake of Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has been wronged. Yes, we admire their decision to pursue a democratic path and fight for their right to do so. But crucially, we also know that this matters to all of us. If Putin were to eke out some kind of win, the rest of the world would suffer too. What starts in Ukraine would not end there. Putin could easily apply his distortions of history elsewhere, such as Moldova or the Baltic states, and others will be emboldened to turn to fighting when it suits them. No country with a large aggressive neighbor would be safe. And that leads to the other great lie. Russia poses as a friend of those who feel cut out by the international system, but it has shown no interest in changes to make it fairer, such as Security Council reform. It does virtually nothing to support the key funds to back the poorest in our world, such as Gavi or the Global Fund, or IDA under the World Bank. And its actions in Ukraine are so brazen so as to threaten the system itself. So yes, we should stand by Ukraine, but not just for Ukraine, not just for Europe, but for the world, and a simple principle: the security of borders, the sanctity of nations, the principle of self-determination. Ukraine's fight is our fight, the world's fight, and the world must stay strong. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, and I now invite His Excellency Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, to take the podium.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates. Tomorrow we will mark 2 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In fact, Russia's aggression against Ukraine began a decade ago with Russia's occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea, the city of Sevastopol, as well as destabilization of Ukraine's Donbas region. We failed to stop Russia back then, and we can see where it brought us. Russia will not stop unless it is stopped. This genocidal war has many objectives: to erase Ukraine as a sovereign country and proud nation from European map, to threaten European security, and to undermine the rules-based international order. The impact of Russia's aggression reaches countries far beyond Ukrainian borders. We've seen how energy prices, food security, and migration are instrumentalized by Russia and its accomplice, Belarus. We've seen how Russia's disruption of Ukraine's exports through Black Sea ports impacted vulnerable populations globally. It is a global issue, not only a European war. If Russia is allowed to continue unabated in Ukraine today, its war will very soon creep into everyone else's backyard. Rogue players across the world will feel emboldened to settle their own issues their own way. Ukraine must receive all possible military, diplomatic, and economic support. Russia and Belarus must face isolation for their contempt for the very core principles on which the United Nations base their existence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most serious threat to the global peace and to the integrity of the entire UN system. If Russia is allowed to continue violating international law with no accountability, including for its crime of aggression, I do not see how we can still sit here in these halls and discuss other issues of today or the future. I do not know what would the future hold if we close our eyes before the genocidal assault by the Russian Federation on Ukrainian children, the illegal deportation to Russia and Belarus, their forced separation from families aimed at erasing their Ukrainian identity. As Russian troops continue attacking Ukraine in several directions, as we receive new and new evidence of Ukrainian war prisoners being executed by Russian occupying forces, as Russia organizes its presidential election in the territories of Ukraine occupied by it, Russian representatives continue exploiting and testing the limits of the international system, continue being elected to governing bodies and positions at the international organizations. That is not the way it should be. Colleagues, today's Russia is driven by revanchism and neocolonial expansionist instincts of the last unreconstructed empire. Kremlin is not interested in peace unless it can dictate its terms. If anyone still have doubts what Russia is capable of, the tragic fate of Alexey Navalny in a Russian prison serves as yet another sobering illustration of the ruthless suppression of dissent and of the alarming pace at which Russia continues its descent into totalitarianism. The body of Alexei must be released to his family without any further delay and any additional conditions. Russia must immediately halt its persecution of politics, release political prisoners, and cease exploitation of the judicial system for political purposes. Kremlin, renowned for its persistent dissemination of a distorted historical narrative, has recently augmented its actions by including a number of Baltic and Polish officials into a so-called list of wanted criminals. These officials have become targets due to their outspoken opposition to Russia's historic revanchonism. Russia must stop such activities. Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine has proposed a clear path to peace, the 10-point peace formula. We urge all nations support this initiative and to not fall into the trap of the so-called peace plans that only aim Ukraine would succumb to the aggressor's agenda. Finally, let me express an honest hope that majority of nations gathered in this hall share the imperative to collectively uphold the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, reaffirming our unwavering commitment to the victory of the just and not the aggressor. An end to this war is possible, but genuine peace cannot be attained through the Russian deceit. The only real path to an enduring peace goes via Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, and I now invite Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, to the podium.
I'm afraid the world will forget about us, because everyone is so focused on Russia's war and the violence in the Middle East. That's what a woman my age in Gorom in South Sudan told me. This woman has fled the violence in Sudan with only a small bag of belongings, carrying her child on her hip. Her words have not left me since. And I know that they ring true for countless women, children, and men around the world who go to bed hungry, who suffer violence. As I stand here, I say straight out, we have not forgotten about you. The fact that Russia's brutal war against Ukraine has been raging for 2 years does not mean that we do not see the suffering of others. A schoolgirl deported from the eastern territory of Ukraine, torn away from her mother, is a child who suffers. A toddler in Gaza who has lost his parents is a child who suffers. A boy in Sudan, hungry, is a child who suffers. Every life matters in equal measure. Humanity is indivisible. The worst thing we could do so now is to play off one person's pain against another's. We would only play into the hands of those who seek to divide us, to push their ruthless agenda in the world. That is why it is nothing but cynical when at the G20 meeting in Rio just 2 days ago, the Russian foreign minister openly asked why the world is so preoccupied with Russia's war against Ukraine. Well, Ms. Lavrov, we are preoccupied with your war because your war is causing death, pain, and destruction. Not just in Ukraine, not just in Bucha and Irpin in the eastern territories of Ukraine, but around the whole world. Russia has bombed ports in Ukraine on purpose to prevent Ukrainian grain from being exported to the world, using on purpose food as a weapon. And this could stop tomorrow if the Russian president were to end this war now. If we care about a world in which every life matters in equal measures, it is up to us and every one of us to stand up against Russia's war. The United Nations was founded for exact that purpose, to make sure alive is alive, that humanity is indivisible. President Putin has proved again and again that to him, human lives count for nothing, neither abroad nor at home, where he now doesn't even shy away from arresting its own children, Russian children, for laying down flowers to mourn the death of Alexey Navalny. As I explained to the women in South Sudan, we did not choose to be so preoccupied with Russia's war of aggression. It's the Russian president's ruthless actions that are forcing us. But that doesn't mean that we do not see the suffering in Sudan, that we don't see the suffering in the Middle East. Like many of you, the devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza is keeping us awake at night. 17,000 children left without a mother or a father. Hundreds of thousands desperate for food and water. This suffering needs to end now. We need Hamas to release all the men, women, and children it took hostage in its ruthless attack on Israel on October 7th. We need a humanitarian pause to work towards a sustainable ceasefire, to find a path towards a life in dignity, peace, and security for both Israelis and Palestinians in 2 states. I know that this conflict has stirred up intense emotions in many of our countries. That is why it's so important not to give in to those who try to play off one person's pain against another's. Political leadership means standing up to polarization, to protect our society from the poison of dehumanization. That is the message to send today here at our General Assembly. We stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, because we stand against a world of ruthlessness. We stand for a world in which alive is alive, whether Palestinian, Israeli, Sudanese, or Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, and I now invite His Excellency Stéphane Séjourné, the Minister of European and Foreign Affairs of France, to the podium.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames les ambassadrices, Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs, en vos grades et qualités, la Russie agresse depuis 2 ans son voisin et inflige depuis 2 ans les pires souffrances à sa population. Cette guerre d'agression ne concerne pas seulement l'Ukraine, elle emporte des graves conséquences pour toutes nos populations. Cela fait 2 ans aussi que la Russie aggrave la crise alimentaire, qu'elle fait consciemment le choix de nourrir son effort de guerre plutôt que d'aider les populations qui en ont besoin, le choix de prendre pour cible et de pilonner chaque jour le système agricole ukrainien, celui d'essayer de bloquer le transport des céréales en mer Noire. Le choix fait par la Russie, c'est donc le choix de ralentir et d'appauvrir l'aide humanitaire, c'est le choix d'affamer. Personne n'est dupe. Ce n'est pas l'envoi ponctuel l'été dernier de quelques cargaisons qui compensera l'immense dommage et fera office d'une véritable lutte contre la faim en Afrique et sur d'autres continents. Laisser la Russie gagner, c'est la laisser détruire l'agriculture et voler les terres aux Ukrainiens. C'est faire gagner la faim la Russie n'aide pas les pays du Sud. La Russie n'aide pas les pays du Sud, et encore moins ses populations, bien au contraire. Et nous devons ici, dans cette instance, le dire clairement. L'insécurité alimentaire, c'est aussi joint à l'insécurité énergétique. La Russie a, pendant 2 ans, menacé les approvisionnements énergétiques et bien sûr, sans jamais le moindre égard pour le changement climatique, la guerre d'agression russe contre l'Ukraine est donc bien une affaire de tous. Elle nous concerne tous aussi parce qu'elle est illégale et injustifiée. Au sein de cette Assemblée, nous sommes une écrasante majorité à vouloir la paix et la sécurité internationale. Cette majorité compte presque 3/4 de notre Assemblée. Et cette majorité n'est pas silencieuse. En 2 ans, 6 fois, l'Assemblée générale a demandé le respect de la souveraineté, de l'indépendance, de l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, celui de la Charte des Nations Unies. En octobre 2022, notre Assemblée avait d'ailleurs logiquement condamné l'occupation illégale de régions entières de l'Ukraine par la Russie. En agressant son voisin, la Russie sape les principes et les règles qui fondent l'ordre international, cet ordre international dont nous sommes ici tous les garants. Personne ne veut d'un monde dans lequel ces principes et ces règles ne sont que de l'encre sur un papier, dans lesquels il est possible d'envahir son voisin en toute impunité. Alors, Monsieur le Président, 2 ans après, il est temps de revenir à la raison. Il est temps que cette agression russe cesse. Nous le demandons. Cette Assemblée l'a plusieurs fois demandé, comme je viens de le dire. La Cour internationale de justice l'a ordonné dès mars 2022. Et je le redirai cet après-midi aussi, au nom de la France, au Conseil de sécurité. Être aux côtés de l'Ukraine, c'est d'être dans le camp du droit. C'est d'être dans le camp du droit, dans le camp de la paix, dans le camp de la sécurité. C'est être juste et humain. Comme le président de la République l'a eu l'occasion d'ailleurs de le redire aux côtés du président Zelensky lors de sa récente visite à Paris, la France se tient et se tiendra aux côtés de l'Ukraine et de son peuple. Je vous remercie.
I thank the Minister for European and Foreign Affairs of France, and I now invite His Excellency José Manuel Albares Bueno, Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, to the podium.
Presidente de la Asamblea General, ministros y muy en particular, ministro Kuleba, querido Dimitro. Hay fechas que marcan la historia y hay fechas que marcan el alma de un pueblo. Mañana, 24 de febrero, hará 2 años que la independencia del pueblo ucraniano fue atacada. Un ataque que fracasará ante la determinación de un pueblo libre. 2 años de una guerra cruel que se ha cobrado un terrible peaje de dolor y destrucción, de familias rotas y de vidas perdidas. 2 años de una guerra insensata, porque ninguna ambición puede estar por encima de la paz y de la vida de millones de seres humanos. Ante una guerra de agresión, el silencio toma partido. Callar va en contra de las víctimas. Esta Asamblea no podíamos permanecer callados y nuestro rechazo de la agresión a Ucrania se ha expresado en 4 resoluciones aprobadas por amplias mayorías de más de 140 votos a favor y menos de 10 en contra. Aceptar que la voluntad de uno puede pasar por encima del orden internacional enviaría una señal muy negativa al resto de naciones del mundo. Sería la negación misma de los principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Asumiríamos resignados la ley del más fuerte y abocaríamos al mundo a un escenario con más conflictos, cada vez más violentos. Por ello, hoy reiteramos nuestra condena a la agresión de Rusia contra Ucrania. Condenamos los continuos ataques contra civiles, áreas residenciales, hospitales, escuelas, también los actos criminales ejercidos contra civiles. A quienes han cometido esos crímenes les mostraremos el camino de la Corte Penal Internacional. No puede haber impunidad. Ante el ataque a Ucrania todos nos indignamos, pero hay quienes hacen más y pese al peligro corren a ayudar. Los ataques a Ucrania han golpeado también a cooperantes y a trabajadores humanitarios. El pasado año, un ataque indiscriminado arrebató la vida de la española Emma Igual, quien protegía a los demás. De esta y de otras atrocidades deberán responder sus autores ante la justicia internacional. Pensando en ellos, pensando en las víctimas, España ha multiplicado su apoyo financiero a la Corte Penal Internacional. Hemos incrementado nuestra contribución obligatoria a la Corte hasta los 7,5 millones de euros anuales, pero también hemos desembolsado contribuciones voluntarias crecientes. El año pasado, dentro de un paquete de contribuciones a la Fiscalía de la Corte de 6 millones de euros, hemos destinado 2 millones de euros para crear un programa de asistencia a víctimas. Somos muchos los que compartimos la convicción de que hace falta actuar en defensa de la justicia, pero la convicción tiene que traducirse en compromiso para ser eficaz. Así lo cree el Gobierno de España y nuestros socios europeos. La Unión Europea ha acogido a casi 10 millones de refugiados ucranianos. 200.000 de ellos han encontrado un hogar temporal en España. También hemos aprobado paquetes de ayuda humanitaria y de ayuda material para que Ucrania pueda ejercer su derecho a la legítima defensa. La inestabilidad generada por el ataque a Ucrania tiene un impacto global que amenaza a miles de millones de personas. Ejemplo de ello es la crisis alimentaria. Rusia ha minado amplias áreas de Ucrania, impidiendo su uso para el cultivo. Se ha retirado de la iniciativa del grano del Mar Negro. Ha bombardeado puertos e infraestructuras para el transporte de grano. Estamos ante la utilización del hambre en los países más vulnerables como otro arma de guerra. Continuamos trabajando con Ucrania para lograr la salida del grano. Hemos consolidado una ruta a través del Mar Negro y reforzado corredores de solidaridad. España ha comprometido 236 millones de euros para luchar contra la inseguridad alimentaria, 4,4 millones para la iniciativa Grano de Ucrania y 2,5 millones al Programa Mundial de Alimentos. Si las consecuencias de la agresión a Ucrania son globales, las respuestas deben ser globales. La fórmula de paz del presidente Zelensky sienta las bases para la paz. Hacemos un llamamiento a todos los miembros de esta Asamblea para que se unan a esta iniciativa que ponga fin a una situación que exige el compromiso de todos. También celebramos la decisión de la Corte Internacional de Justicia de declararse competente sobre las alegaciones de genocidio y exigimos a Rusia que cumpla las medidas cautelares dictadas por el tribunal. Exigimos la retirada inmediata de sus tropas de la totalidad del territorio ucraniano. La agresión a Ucrania no debe durar ni un día más. Hoy estamos aquí en recuerdo de aquel terrible 24 de febrero. Estamos aquí defendiendo la paz, defendiendo los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Y seguiremos al lado de Ucrania hasta que nos reunamos de nuevo en esta misma Asamblea, no para recordar el primer día de una guerra cruel, sino para celebrar su último día y el comienzo de una paz justa para una Ucrania libre. Muchas gracias.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, and I now invite Her Excellency Hanke Gerdina Johannet Bruinslot, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Netherlands, to the podium.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, there's a picture that I would like to show here today, but I cannot. The photo is of a man whose name I would like to mention here today, but I cannot, because it would put him in danger. And so, today, I will call him Andrei. He's a commander in the Ukrainian army, a young father with a family. For 2 years, he's been fighting for the peace and security of its own country. For 2 years, he has barely seen his family. Because Andrei does not allow himself a moment rest. He's prioritizing his children's future over the precious moments he would love to spend with them now. It's the most impressive encounter that I have had as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Not for a moment, not for a second, does he allow himself to lose focus, to feel doubt, or simply to recharge. Not for a moment does he allow himself to think even about giving up. It's his strength, this resilience that I see in the eyes of all the Ukrainians I meet. It is truly remarkable how the people of Ukraine have been able to withstand Russia's aggression for so long. Mr. President, in the same theme, we must continue to support Ukraine. At the same time, of course, our attention and action are required in so many other places. The conflict between Israel and Hamas, resulting in so many innocent victims. The grim tragedy unfolding in Sudan, and the misery in so many other places in the world. Violence that is driving communities to despair, violence that must be stopped. And that's precisely why we can't allow our gaze to shift away from Ukraine. Not only because Russia is slowly destroying Ukraine, but because Russia's war on Ukraine is an assault on the world, on the principle of sovereignty that we all stand for, on the UN Charter that we all signed, on the rules-based order that we all value. And so it is in our interest for Ukraine to withstand Russia's aggression, for it to stop Russia's aggression. And that's why we must support Ukraine, not half-heartedly, not temporarily. We must do whatever it takes for as long as it takes, because there can be no lasting security without recovery, and there can be no lasting peace without justice. Indeed, the only viable end to war is a just peace. And that's why we support Ukraine's Zelensky's peace formula. And it's why we're taking the lead in restoring justice for Ukraine. It is in our common interest to hold the perpetrators of this war to account, because there can never be peace without justice for the victims. Mr. President, over the past 2 years, we have all seen how food prices have skyrocketed, how energy prices have soared, and how hunger has increased in some of the world's most vulnerable places. This senseless war of choice needs to stop for all our sakes. My hope is vested in collaboration that endures, even when times are tough, because in an increasingly polarized world, such collaboration can help us reach shared goals. And so my hope is vested in us, everyone gathered here in this esteemed assembly. While our perspectives may vary, sometimes even radically, we all want to forge a tomorrow that is a safer, more stable, and more prosperous than it is now. Not a tomorrow where might is right, but a legacy we all want for our children. In the spirit of Andrei, we must prioritize the future of our world, the future of our children over our differences. And so we must support Ukraine. We must do whatever it takes for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I now invite Her Excellency Linda Thomas-Greenfield.
In the time since, we've seen Russian forces commit unspeakable brutality and crimes against humanity, and we've watched in real time as the Kremlin sought to rewrite history. Through torture and deportation, re-education and indoctrination, repression and disinformation, Russia has tried to deny Ukrainian identity, to stifle dissent, to rationalize the unconscionable. But we know the truth. We know the truth. This is not a war of liberation. This is not a war of Russian self-defense. This is not a war of last resort. It never has been. And it certainly isn't today. Colleagues, this is a moment for somber remembrance. And it is an opportunity to reaffirm our support for the principles of the United Nations Charter and for the people of Ukraine. Not in spite of the fact that so many are suffering elsewhere, but because the fight for security, for humanity, for self-determination is universal. Ukrainians have shown us what it means to fight for those values every day against the steepest of odds. And so we owed it to them to tell the story Russia so desperately wishes to hide. Stories of religious leaders detained or murdered for daring to pray for their country, of journalists, dissidents, and political activists targeted and tortured, but continuing to sound the alarm, of communities whose churches were seized, their streets stripped of their Ukrainian names, their residents required to obtain Russian passports to receive basic services, of hundreds of men, women, and children executed by Russian soldiers in Bucha, their children's camp converted into a torture chamber, their bodies tossed into mass graves, and of thousands and thousands of children ripped from their families and relocated into Russia. Children like Margarita, a 10-month-old Ukrainian baby who was taken from Kherson Children's Hospital and is still being held by a Putin ally. Through it all, the Ukrainian people have embodied the spirit that artwork outside the council shows: to protect life, to protect life. Ordinary, extraordinary people, vastly outnumbered, fiercely defending their communities, teachers transforming bunkers into classrooms, city workers finding ways to restore heat and electricity after bombardments, families rationing food to feed their neighbors. Their unbreakable spirit must be a model for all of us, because this war This brazen violation of the UN Charter affects all of us. Russia's attack on Ukrainian agricultural infrastructure have exacerbated food insecurity across the globe. Russia's use of energy exports as a coercive tool have caused volatility in global markets. Russia's destruction of land, water, and air have damaged the environment of the entire Black Sea region. And Russia's procurement of munitions from the DPRK, including ballistic missiles and launchers, has undermined the global nonproliferation regime. As a global community, we have come together before to condemn Russia's violations of the UN Charter and reject its illegal attempts to seize Ukrainian territory. We have found ways around Russia's war on the world's food supply. And we have chosen diplomacy and dialogue, even as Russia has elected for destruction and disorder. But just as Putin is hoping Ukrainian resolve will fade, he is counting on ours to dissipate as well. And so the task before us is clear. 10 years since this campaign began, and 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, we must continue to stand with Ukraine and stand up for international order. And here's what that looks like. First, we must resist the false choices and equivalencies that Russia continues to throw at us in an attempt to divide us. The false notion that Ukraine bears equal responsibility for beginning the war and equal power to end it, when we know this conflict was started and this conflict wages on because of one small man. The false notion that we must agree on everything in order to do anything, and the false notion that tackling this challenge means ignoring other ones. Colleagues, I know that Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th and all of the devastation that has come after it have rightly been a focus of global attention and concern. And though many of us share a common goal of reaching a durable peace, I've heard from people, including many of you, who have real disagreements with how we create that peace. But to be clear, our care for one people does not in any way negate the care for another. Compassion is not a zero-sum game. Defending peace and security is not zero-sum. And any insinuation otherwise is in and of itself a false choice. And so as we continue to work around the clock to find the best course of action in the Middle East, we cannot lose sight of Russia's brutality in Ukraine. And we cannot forget the plight of Ukrainians who are still fighting and dying for their freedom. Which brings me to my next point. We must speak in a unified voice to demand Russia in this war. That means calling for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders and uphold the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It means calling on states like Iran and the DPRK to end their military support for an illegal aggression. And it means ensuring we bring justice to victims of Russia's horrific crimes, because behind every statistic is a person with a story. And that brings me to my final point. We must not grow numb to the plight of the Ukrainian people. There's a phrase I've heard tossed around recently, Ukraine fatigue. The idea that years into this war, our support and attention are faltering. And yet I cannot imagine explaining that we're tired to the people I met in Ukraine, to the woman who'd been raped by Russian soldiers and had no joy on her face, to the medical workers detained and tortured by Russian forces for weeks, and to the 10-year-old who more than anything simply wanted to go back to school and see her friends. The mother who lost her child in an attack on her home, who held her baby in her arms as she died. Colleagues, those Ukrainians, those families who cannot afford to be fatigued are counting on us to defend the United Nations Charter and hold those who violate it to account, to resist division and fatigue, to come together, to push for diplomacy, for dialogue, and for a just, durable peace, to protect life so that freedom and democracy can once again bloom in Ukraine and everywhere that is under attack. That was our charge when we gathered 2 years ago, and that is our charge today. So let us not falter or fail. Thank you.
I thank the member of the Cabinet of the President of the United States and permanent representative to the United Nations. And I now invite Her Excellency Lisbeth Zilmer-Johns, the State Secretary for Foreign Policy of Denmark, to the podium, speaking on behalf of the Nordic countries.
President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor to address the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Today marks 2 years of Ukrainians defending themselves against Russia's full-scale invasion. This month also marks 10 years since the start of Russia's war of aggression and illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia, a nuclear power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is waging a war on its free and independent neighboring country, Ukraine, in brutal violation of the United Nations Charter. The war is an attack on democracy and a flagrant violation of international law, and it has created far-reaching and devastating global consequences, such as the food and energy crisis. We must all stand with Ukraine to change this course. President, Ukraine and its people have shown incredible resilience and determination during 10 years of Russia's aggression. The war has caused immense suffering for Ukrainians, especially children and other persons in vulnerable situations. Russia's airstrikes have repeatedly targeted civilians and critical infrastructure. Millions of people have been displaced, either within Ukraine or to somewhere far away from their home country. We are appalled by the devastating consequences and the still deteriorating humanitarian situation. In the temporarily occupied territories, we see numerous reports of sexual violence and torture against civilians, and the forced transfer or unlawful deportation of persons, including children, out of Ukraine. We must ensure that international crimes are investigated and perpetrators held to account. Ukraine and Ukrainians continue to pay a high price for Russia's aggression. The reconstruction of Ukraine has started. It will take years to build back what has been destroyed. We are committed to supporting Ukraine in these endeavors. President, exactly a year ago, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. All the Nordic countries supported this resolution, together with an overwhelming majority of the United Nations member states. For us Nordics, the choice was clear. We are strong defenders of international law, including international humanitarian law. Flagrant violations of international humanitarian law, attacks on civilians and civilian objects, and impunity for war crimes cannot be tolerated. We continue to stand up against all violations of international law wherever they occur. Mr. President, the Nordics support President Zelensky's peace formula and a peace summit based on Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. We share the view that Ukraine alone shall define the prerequisites for peace. But Ukraine cannot achieve the peace it deserves alone. Therefore, it is of utmost importance that we ensure the broadest possible international support for Ukraine's peace formula. This is not an isolated war. It has clear regional and global consequences. President, the Nordic countries continue to call on Russia to immediately stop its illegal war of aggression, withdraw all its forces, and respect Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We must hold Russia accountable for its actions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished State Secretary for Foreign Policy of Denmark. And now I give the floor to the distinguished His Excellency Nicolas Marche, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to mark a dark and somber anniversary. Almost 2 years have passed since Russia launched its war of aggression, unprovoked and unjustifiable, against its neighbor Ukraine. 2 years of Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure, 2 years of human suffering, millions of lives uprooted and livelihoods destroyed, and 2 years of global consequences of this war, including Russia holding global food supply chains hostage for its cynical political ambitions, thereby displaying utter disregard for the plight of the people living in the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. Today's debate is also a reminder that this war did not only start in February 22. 10 years ago, Russia illegally occupied and annexed Crimea. As members of a global order founded on international law, we cannot accept to live in a world where the law of the powerful overrides the rule of law. As a neutral country, Austria particularly relies on the respect and implementation of international law, treaties, and customs for its security. None of us can afford to stand idly by while the fundamental principles of our shared legal and security order are violated, not in Ukraine and not anywhere in the world. On top of Russia's illegal occupation of whole regions of Ukraine, the civilian population has been subjected to massive attacks, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Ukrainian cities such as Bucha and Mariupol have become synonymous for unspeakable human suffering. Russia has reportedly deported thousands of Ukrainian children to the occupied territories or to Russia. We must do everything in our power to bring these children back to their homes and families. We must be clear that there can be no sustainable peace without justice and accountability. Crimes cannot go unpunished. We fully support all efforts to ensure accountability, including by the International Criminal Court and the UN Commission of Inquiry based in Vienna. Mr. President, Austria stands in full solidarity with Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people. The humanitarian consequences of Russia's war and its impact on the civilian population and on the environment cannot be overstated. As part of our humanitarian efforts, we have welcomed Ukrainian refugees in Austria. Since February 22, over 100,000 refugees have been registered. More than 70,000 are currently residing in Austria, and over 13,000 Ukrainian children are currently being schooled in Austrian schools. Moreover, Austria has so far provided over 200 million euros in bilateral humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. In addition, 1/3 of the Ukrainian territory may have been contaminated, but with mines and unexploded weapons. Therefore, we have provided more than 7 million euro for demining efforts in Ukraine. Furthermore, we have to continue to help Ukraine export its grain to those countries who need it most around the globe. Many measures are in place: solidarity lanes, reinforcement of river ports, as well as other multilateral efforts together with our partners, like the Grain from Ukraine initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, nuclear risks are higher today than they have been in decades. We welcome efforts by the international community to work together, foremost through the IAEA in Vienna and on the ground, to secure the nuclear energy facilities that have become targets in the war. We welcome the tireless work of the IAEA teams in all nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and in particular in Zaporizhzhia. All this underscores the utmost urgency of progress on nuclear disarmament and of moving away from the nuclear deterrence. Mr. President, my final point. The United Nations and other multilateral organizations, such as the OSCE in Vienna, are indispensable fora in which member states can address and hopefully resolve their disputes in an inclusive dialogue setting. In these troubled times, we need more multilateralism and more dialogue, not less of it. This entails also talking to those we do not agree with. We must preserve and strengthen these organizations and enable them to fulfill their role. Exactly 1 year ago, at this assembly, an overwhelming majority of 141 states called on Russia to stop this war, to stop the suffering, to stop the nuclear threats, and to stop the blatant breaches of the UN Charter. From around the world, we have heard consistent calls for peace. No country longs for peace more than Ukraine, a lasting peace that is comprehensive, just, and based on the UN Charter and international law, just as this assembly demanded 1 year ago. This is why Austria supports the peace formula presented by Ukraine, as well as a broad-based peace summit on the basis of this formula at the right point in time. This peace has yet to become reality. It is in the Kremlin's power to stop this war immediately. Once again, we therefore call on Russia to stop its aggression, to withdraw its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to end the bloodshed. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Austria. And now I give the floor to the distinguished Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania, His Excellency Traian Hristia.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, as we mark 2 years since the beginning of the Russian Federation's fully fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, we continue to see a disturbing level of hostilities with no sign of abatement, with unimaginable sufferings for the civilian population and dire, long-lasting consequences. It is important to underline here at the United Nations that this continued aggression undermines the core of the rules-based international order and effective multilateralism, and remains a matter of concern for the entire international community. However, Russian Federation's aggression did not start with the war it launched on 24th of February 2022, but with the illegal annexation of Crimean Peninsula back in 2014. This is the main reason for which we must continue firmly condemning at the United Nations the war of aggression against Ukraine. The support of the international community is critical during these difficult times, and I would like here to echo the statement of His Excellency Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Ukraine remains very important for the global community for reasons concerning not only the respect for the United Nations Charter and the international law, including the humanitarian law, but also for the very serious and concrete impact that the Russian Federation aggression has on various fields at global level, and I will limit myself to name the dramatic aggravation of the food insecurity which affects the most vulnerable countries and populations. Romania will continue to support Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity with within its internationally recognized borders. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the so-called referenda organized by Russian Federation in the occupied territories of Ukraine. These actions are illegal and illegitimate, a grave breach of fundamental principles of international law, and another flagrant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Reports coming from Crimea and other temporarily occupied regions are disturbing, showing many instances of politically motivated violence, imprisonment, and torture. All crimes must be duly investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. Russia must be held responsible for its wrongful and unlawful conduct. The world has to send a clear message. There is no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering. Therefore, we need the full force and legitimacy of the General Assembly to reaffirm with full determination that international law matters, that the United Charter matters, and that we stand by the rules put in place for the protection of every single member state of this organization. Romania will continue to be a trustful, credible, and involved multilateral partner. From day one of this war, the government and population of Romania acted as first responders in providing help to the Ukrainians that sought shelter in our country. Also, we continue to commit to supporting global efforts on food security, facilitating so far the transit of more than 34 million tons of Ukrainian grains. The ongoing war in Ukraine has a major impact in the region, challenging the resilience of neighboring states. We have extended a helping hand to our neighbor, the Republic of Moldova, the country most affected by war except Ukraine itself. Mr. President, we have to work together to bring peace back to its deserving place. Romania fully supports the Ukrainian peace formula as the single framework conducive to a fair, lasting, and sustainable peace based on the principles of the UN Charter we have stood up for in the past. And one principle is clear, legally and morally. Ukraine alone has the political and moral legitimacy to decide if, when, and on what terms it wants to engage with the Russian Federation. Our call is clear. Russia must abide by the rules of international law. It must unconditionally cease the use of force and withdraw completely and immediately from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Romania warmly praises the resilience and courage of the Ukrainian people who heroically resisted through the last 2 past years, and we will continue to stand by Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Kyoto Tsuji, State Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the UN Charter is a common agreement which all member states must observe in good faith. It's the foundation of all international relations. For this very reason, we cannot condone Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. This General Assembly has repeatedly stated that Russia's aggression is a clear violation of international law, including the Charter. Unilateral change of the status quo by force is never acceptable anywhere in the world. There's no country that does not want peace in Ukraine. However, peace cannot reward the aggressor. It must be comprehensive, just, and lasting, based on the purposes and principles of the Charter. We, the member states, affirmed this 1 year ago in this hall. Nevertheless, the people of Ukraine continue to suffer from Russia's unprovoked aggression. Russia must be held accountable for all its atrocities. Other UN member states must also refrain from supporting the aggression, either directly or indirectly. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the people of Ukraine also need a hopeful vision for their future. Last November, I led an economic mission to Kyiv to promote Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. We discussed concrete measures with Prime Minister Shmyhal and the business community and promised to accelerate these efforts. On February 19th, we invited Prime Minister Shmyhal to Japan and held the Japan-Ukraine Conference for Promotion of Economic Growth and Reconstruction in Tokyo. Tangible results were achieved, including the signing of more than 50 cooperation documents. In addition, we concluded the new tax convention on part of the development of a legal infrastructure. Japan also decided to introduce measures to relax the multi-entry visa requirement for Ukrainians involved in Japan-Ukrainian cooperation projects. We would like to highlight that during the conference, we held a session on women, peace, and security, what we call WPS, with the aim of promoting discussions on how to incorporate a WPS perspective into the process of recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine. This session also affirmed our commitment to the protection of women, including through healthcare, shelter development, and protection of victims of gender-based violence. Women and children, particularly those made vulnerable by conflict, must be protected. Japan will continue to take the lead in promoting WPS at the UN as well. By holding this conference, we demonstrated our unwavering commitment to supporting Ukraine. Japan will continue to lead international efforts to support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, these initiatives, however, will not fully materialize and bring sufficient benefit to the Ukrainian people unless Russia stops its aggression. We must continue our efforts to maintain and strengthen the international order based on the rule of law and realize a safe and secure world where human dignity is protected. Japan is determined to play a leading role to strengthen the functions of the UN, including through reform of the Security Council to enable it to fulfill its primary role. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I'd like to pay my heartfelt compliments to Foreign Minister Kuleba and to the people of Ukraine who continue their efforts to restore peace. Japan will stand with Ukraine until peace and justice prevail. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Jan Marian, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Czechia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, exactly 10 years ago, Russia started an unprovoked war of aggression against its neighbor. 8 years later, escalated Russia its illegal aggression against Ukraine even further by launching a full-scale invasion. This unprecedented attack by a permanent member of the Security Council has had far-reaching consequences. By violating the rights of Ukraine to independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, Russia is putting peace and security at risk globally. In conducting its war of aggression, Russia has repeatedly targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. UN investigations have confirmed Russia's responsibility for gross violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Bucha and Irpin became tragic symbols of this brutality. Mr. President, these violations of international law have been accompanied by other means of warfare, such as the Russian attempts to block the export of grain from Ukraine. Energy blackmailing by Russia resulted in soaring prices of energy, thus fueling inflation globally. As a result, Russia took all of us hostages of its aggressive imperialistic policy. Mr. President, now that Ukraine is entering the third year of a massive land, air, sea, and information war, we often hear that peace should be reached through diplomatic means and negotiations. But let us be clear, there is one state that can end this war immediately, today. To that end, we reiterate our call on Russia to cease its unlawful aggression and to withdraw completely and from the whole territory of Ukraine. Under no circumstances should the aggressor behavior be rewarded by doubtful compromises enforced through peer pressure or military threats. It is only up to Ukraine to define what a durable and just peace should look like. Czechia, as well as more than 80 other countries from all over the world, is actively participating in the peace formula process outlined by President Zelensky. We consider this peace proposal as the only viable and legitimate. At a massive cost, Ukrainian people have defended their country and their sovereignty. They count on us, the international community, to do our part. From our side, there is no doubt Czechia will proudly stand by Ukraine until it prevails in its just fight and the aggressor is held accountable. Mr. President, as we speak, Russia, with its war of aggression, continues to violate not only the United Nations Charter, but the very purpose the UN was set up for, the maintenance of peace. We must not allow Russia's challenge to the rule-based international order, in which might trumps right, and fundamental values are blatantly violated. If we do so, we will create space for similar aggressive behavior elsewhere in the world. This is why a stake in Ukraine prevailing as a sovereign nation within its internationally recognized borders. The world needs to take a clear and firm position that such aggression is not acceptable. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Czechia. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Sean Fleming, Minister of State for International Development and Diaspora of Ireland.
President, today we mark the second anniversary of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russia has needlessly taken many thousands of lives, both Russian and Ukrainian, and forced 14 million people from their homes. For those who have remained, Russia's indiscriminate attack on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure continues. Russia is kidnapping and deporting thousands of Ukrainian children, robbing them of their families and their identities. This brutality is deliberate and calculated. It is designed to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Make no mistake, Russia's actions are a threat to each and every one of us and to the foundations of the international rules-based system upon which the United Nations is built. That is why Ireland, the European Union, and so many UN member states present here today have taken decisive action in response to Russia's aggression. We will continue to do whatever it takes because we understand what is at stake, not just for Ukraine or for Europe, but for the global community of nations. The global community has responded to Russia. On 6 occasions in the 11th emergency session, this body strongly endorsed resolutions that reaffirmed a global commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This body has demanded the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military personnel from Ukrainian territory. Russia refuses to implement every resolution adopted so far. Our economic and humanitarian support for Ukraine, our hosting of Ukrainian refugees, and our initiatives to ensure accountability for Russia's violations of international law are an integral part of our response. Communities across Ireland and Europe have been playing their part in this effort, demonstrating compassion and support for Ukrainian struggle by providing safe refuge to those fleeing their homes. The Irish people have welcomed 105,000 Ukrainians into our communities, which amounts to over 2% of the population of our state. The historic decision by the European Council to open a accession negotiation with Ukraine was a strong signal to the Ukrainian people that Ukraine belongs within the European family in that global community of nations. It is also a clear signal to Russia that we will continue to stand with Ukraine for the long term. President, Ireland was shocked and outraged at the death of Alexey Navalny in a Russian prison last week. His incarceration and death once again demonstrates the Russian government's contempt for democratic values and human rights. It also reminds us why the Ukrainian people have no wish to be governed by Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has severely disrupted global food and energy markets, affecting the world's most vulnerable people. Russia makes a pretense of supporting the most vulnerable, but Russia is only interested in imposing Moscow's will. We saw this clearly through Russia's inexcusable decision to unilaterally withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, compounding an already critical situation on world food markets. Ukraine, on the other hand, is working to contribute to global food safety and security. Ukraine and EU partners have managed to stabilize food prices and help feed the world's hungry through the European Solidarity Lanes, the Black Sea Humanitarian Corridor, and the Grain from Europe initiative. Ireland is a small, militarily neutral country, dependent on global trade and stable relations between nations grounded in diplomacy. The multilateral system remains our strongest protection and our most important global security asset. We rely on this system for our very existence as a sovereign democratic nation. Russia's war of aggression challenges this to its very core. If we allow Russia to prevail in Ukraine, they will be encouraged to pursue their imperialist agenda against others, and we will all suffer the consequences. As Ukraine defends their nation, Ukrainians are also defending our fundamental freedoms, the right to live peacefully within their own borders without fear of being attacked. Under President Zelensky's peace formula, Ukraine is working towards that right we all claim, to determine our own future in peace and security, in line with the UN Charter and international law. Ukraine deserves the unqualified support of every single member state of this global community, these United Nations. Ireland pledges our unwavering support today and always. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Minister of State for International Development and Diaspora of Ireland. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Reinis Brusbardis, Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 24th of February 2022 will forever be recalled as the day when Russia started its unprovoked and illegal invasion of peaceful Ukraine. 2 years on, Russia's brutal war of aggression continues to bring immense pain and suffering to people of Ukraine. Russia, a permanent member of United Nations Security Council, is violating international law and the United Nations Charter by invading a sovereign neighboring country. It's a shameful attack against the rules-based international order, We as an international community must be resolute and stand against such an attack. This General Assembly has overwhelmingly condemned Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine and attempted illegal annexation of Ukrainian regions. Furthermore, the impact of this senseless war is felt globally, and as the food crisis elevates, Russia must be stopped, and it is in all our interests. Mr. President, it is vital that the international community continues to provide all necessary support to Ukraine. Latvia stands together with Ukraine and strongly believes in its victory. Temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and the people therein are not forgotten. These territories and Ukrainians in them are an integral part of Ukraine. Donetsk, Kherson, Lugansk, and Zaporozhye regions, along with the Crimea and Sevastopol, are and will remain Ukraine. We call upon Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Meanwhile, Russia is undertaking efforts to wipe out Ukrainian culture and identity in the temporarily occupied territories. Horrific crimes that Russia has committed in Ukraine remind of the bitter experience of Latvian people during the Soviet occupation. Filtration camps, forceful deportation of civilians, forced mobilization, illegal detention and prosecution, execution outside courts, illegal abduction of children, and forced passportization are from the same playbook. Russia continues to deny its committed crimes, seeks to justify its illegal invasion, and blames anyone but itself for it. War crimes committed by Russia cannot go unpunished, and accountability must be ensured. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. And now I give the floor to Her Excellency, Lauri Tiarala, State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first, we align ourselves with the joint Nordic statement presented by Denmark. Mr. President, tomorrow, 2 years have passed since Russia began its illegal, full-scale war of aggression in Ukraine. For 2 years, we have witnessed Russia's unprovoked invasion. At the same time, Ukrainians have shown their incredible resilience, actually starting already 10 years ago with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the following war in eastern Ukraine. Today, tremendous human suffering continues in Ukraine. Our thoughts are with the brave people of Ukraine who are defending their families, their freedom, and their country. Our thoughts are especially with the children forcefully deported by Russia and their families. We will continue to speak for them and others who are suffering from the consequences of Russia's brutal war. Mr. President, Russia's illegal war is not only a European problem. It is not only a Western problem, and it is not only a problem of rich countries. It has immense global consequences, especially in the field of food and energy. This needs to stop. Mr. President, Ukraine deserves a just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter. Therefore, Finland participates in the implementation of President Zelensky's peace formula. It is the only serious and viable plan to secure a peaceful future for Ukraine. Broad international support and engagement is essential as we build up to the upcoming peace summit. All of our efforts can make a difference. Ukraine has immediate needs to which we must respond now. But obviously, that is not enough. The Ukrainians will need our extensive support also in the long term. The reconstruction efforts will be immense, and they have fortunately already started. Finland is firmly committed to contributing to the reconstruction of Ukraine in the coming years. Mr. President, Russia must immediately end its brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We, once again, call on Russia to respect the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Finland continues to condemn Russia's blatant violations of human rights, international humanitarian law, and the UN Charter. Finland continues to stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And now I give floor to His Excellency Dasha Darsaria, First Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it has been 2 years since Russia unleashed its war of aggression against Ukraine. This aggressive policy and the illegal attempts to forcefully redraw the borders of the sovereign neighbors have been assaulted on the international rules-based order, blatant violation of the principles of UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Charter of Paris, and have shattered security architecture in Europe and beyond. Implications of this war go beyond national boundaries and exacerbate already massive scale of global challenges. The past 2 years of war have entailed humanitarian consequences and destruction of immense scale. Russian tactics of targeted attacks on civilian objects and infrastructure with high casualties among the civilian population of Ukraine is unacceptable. Distinguished delegates, up to this day, Russia continues illegal occupation of my country's Abkhazia and Tkhinvali regions. Therefore, security environment in and around Georgia is further deteriorating. Besides the human rights situation on the ground remains dire. Russian occupation continues to take a heavy toll on innocent civilians and has recently claimed lives of several Georgian citizens. It remains alarming that despite the grave situation in both occupied regions of Georgia, the access of international human rights mechanisms is continuously denied by Russia, the power exercising effective control on the ground, as it has been confirmed by the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Distinguished delegates, along with the international community, Georgia has been demonstrating full solidarity to Ukraine with political and diplomatic steps, as well as providing substantial humanitarian assistance. Georgia has supported all the resolutions and initiatives made by all major international organizations in support of Ukraine. Allow me to reiterate Georgia's fierce support to the peace initiatives of Ukraine, the key points of which are based on the Charter and therefore go beyond the restoration of peace and territorial integrity of Ukraine, having overarching aim of defending the core values of the United Nations. Georgia has received and is supporting more than 28,000 war-affected Ukraine. The government implements special care projects and provides them with accommodation, schooling, and healthcare services. Let me one more time reaffirm Georgia's unwavering support to the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We reiterate our call upon the Russian Federation immediately cease the aggression and withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the whole territory of Ukraine. We will stand in solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency First Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia. And now I give floor to His Excellency Spiridon Lampridis, Special Envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we sadly mark 2 years since Russia's unjustified and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, but also 10 years from Crimea's illegal annexation, actions that we fully condemn from our side. The entire international democratic community has promptly rallied behind Ukraine from the very beginning, condemning the violation of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of a fellow member of the UN. My country has followed with deep sorrow and agony the horrific destruction and uprooting of normal lives for thousands of Greek origin Ukrainians that lived for long centuries in the region of the Azov Sea, and in particular around the city of Mariupol that is currently under Russian troops' harsh occupation. The entire community has been decimated, with people killed, wounded, traumatized, families scattered, children abducted, non-combatants turned to refugees overnight, with their livelihood and properties destroyed, lost forever. We're also deeply saddened by the indiscriminate attacks from the air against the city of Odessa, yet another historic center for Greek communities living in Ukraine and a UNESCO Common Cultural Heritage Site. At this critical juncture, those that support freedom, peace, and the rule of law in international relations must not, however, lose faith. The just and difficult struggle of the Ukrainian people is obviously not only about the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. It concerns and affects us all, over the entire European continent, the sensitive East Mediterranean region, but also the global community in the sense of food and energy security. If, after all, contemporary revisionists are allowed to force their way in achieving their goals in the mid of the 21st century, then the entire international rules-based order is doomed to collapse, and the very fabric of our democratic societies will be at peril. We all need to play our part in the difficult path, but substantially supporting in every possible way the aggressed party and by condemning the aggressor that bears full responsibility for multiple violations of international and humanitarian law that have recklessly caused extensive suffering to the civilian population, as well as colossal damage in the country's infrastructure and economy. Immediately stop its actions and completely withdraw from Ukraine in line with numerous UN General Assembly resolutions. Greece, in the realistic framework of its capabilities, does and will continue doing its utmost to help alleviating the suffering of innocent civilians and people in need. We have just organized an important international conference on Ukraine's reconstruction in Athens last Thursday, while we intend to continue contributing in every possible way with perseverance, including the energy, transport, and logistics sectors, through our strategic ports constituting a vital providing hub in northern Greece, but also through our powerful merchant fleet in transporting goods, grain, and energy to and from Ukraine. In view of the ongoing humanitarian disaster and human suffering caused by this atrocious war, the international community should begin considering assisting the parties involved to ultimately converge towards a reasonable, peaceful solution that will restore sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and fully respect the rights and legitimate aspirations of all people living in the region for a peaceful, decent, and prosperous life that they undoubtedly deserve. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank His Excellency Special Envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece. We have heard the last speaker in the debate of this item for this meeting. We shall now hear the remaining speakers on Monday, 26 February at 10 a.m. in this hall, after the consideration of other items announced in the United Nations Journal. The exercise of right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. Now, what is it? Right of reply have been requested by Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Mr. President, my delegation is compelled to take the floor to exercise its right of reply in response to the provocative statement made by the United States. We categorically reject the United States' outrageous and groundless claims as grave political provocation and reckless act against the DPRK. The United States is very eager to abuse this platform and deceive the international community for its fully justify its illegal offer of weapons to Ukraine while persistently spreading the groundless rumor of arms dealings between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. We take this opportunity to make clear our stand once again that we have never had arms dealings with the Russian Federation and that we have no plan to do so in the future either. We strongly denounce the hostile forces for their rumor of arms dealings as a plot-breeding story against the DPRK, as well as a part of hostile attempt to tarnish the image of the DPRK in the international arena by invoking the illegal sanctions resolution against the DPRK. The United States is the very one that is driving the Ukraine crisis to the brink of world nuclear war by continuously sending notorious lethal weapons, including cluster bombs, to the Ukraine battlefield. As such, it has no legal right and moral justification to slander the normal cooperation between the sovereign states in the field of national defense for peace and security in the region and the rest of the world. The international community should focus on the United States criminal acts of bringing bloodshed and destruction to Ukraine by providing it with various kinds of lethal weapons and equipment on a large scale, rather than lending an ear to the groundless claim of arms dealings between the DPRK and the Russian Federation, fabricated by some dishonest forces for political purposes. The United States should be mindful that if it persists in spreading the self-made rumor against the DPRK and provoking us groundlessly, it will face a really undesirable result. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The Assembly has just concluded the stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 62. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Ambassador, as always.
Pleasure.